You've reached a place where history unfolds slowly, one quiet story at a time. So settle into a comfortable position, dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the distractions of today fade into the background. There's nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do except listen. Together, we'll wander through forgotten civilizations, remarkable journeys, and the everyday lives of people who came long before us. Take a slow, comfortable breath, relax, and let the past gently carry you toward sleep. Tonight, our journey begins in the city of Rome itself, not in the ash-covered streets of Pompeii that so many documentaries return to, but in the beating, breathing heart of the empire, sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, when the city held perhaps 1 million people within its walls, and along its winding, sloping hills. We begin before dawn, in the hour the Romans called the deepest part of the night, when the sky above the 7 hills is still a deep and unbroken navy, and the only light in most of the city comes from the moon, or from the small oil lamps flickering behind shuttered windows. Rome at this hour is not silent. It is never entirely silent, but it is quiet in the way that only a sleeping city can be quiet. A hush punctuated by small human sounds. Somewhere below, in a narrow street, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass shoulder to shoulder, a cartwheel creaks softly over uneven paving stones. During the daylight hours, wheeled traffic is forbidden within the city walls, a law put in place generations earlier to ease the crowding of Rome's narrow streets. And so it is only now, in these dark hours before sunrise, that the carts move freely, bringing in the food the city will need to feed itself for another day. The carts come from the countryside beyond the walls, from farms along the Tiber Valley, and from the great port town of Ostia, where ships arrive from Egypt, from Sicily, from the coasts of North Africa, carrying grain that will become the bread of 1 million mouths. The drivers speak to their oxen in low voices, guiding them gently through the dark, past sleeping tenement blocks called Insulae that rise 5 and 6 stories into the night sky, past the closed doors of shops whose owners are still asleep on pallets in the small rooms behind their counters. If you were to walk beside one of these carts, you would notice the smell of the city before you noticed almost anything else. It is not an unpleasant smell exactly, though it is a strong one, a mixture of wood smoke from banked cooking fires, the mineral scent of the nearby river, the faint sweetness of hay and livestock, and underneath it all, the particular smell of a place where so many people live so closely together. Rome does not smell like a modern city. It smells like something older, earthier, more alive. Above the streets, in small rooms on the upper floors of the Insulae, families are beginning to stir. These apartment buildings, built of brick and timber, and sometimes rising unevenly where landlords added extra floors without much concern for safety, house the overwhelming majority of Rome's population. A wealthy family might own an entire private house, a domus, with an open courtyard and a garden. But most Romans, the vast working middle and lower classes live in these crowded blocks, often in a single room shared by an entire family. In one such room, a woman named, let us imagine, Lucia. We cannot know her real name, but women like her lived and worked in every corner of this city, rises quietly so as not to wake her children. She moves in the dark with the practiced ease of someone who has done this every morning of her adult life. She reaches for a small clay lamp, tips a little oil into its reservoir, and touches a glowing ember from the previous night's fire to its wick. The small flame catches, and a warm, dim light fills the corner of the room. There is no running water in most of these apartments, and certainly no way to cook a proper meal inside them. Since the fire risk in these tightly packed wooden buildings is severe and well understood by everyone who lives in them. So Lucia's morning begins not with cooking, but with a walk. She takes up 2 clay jars and makes her way down a narrow, creaking staircase, out into the street, and toward the nearest public fountain, one of hundreds scattered across the city, fed by one of Rome's great aqueducts, which carry fresh water for many miles from springs and lakes in the hills beyond the city. The aqueducts themselves are worth pausing on for a moment. Here, in this quiet hour, when there is time to notice such things. By this period in Rome's history, the city is served by many multiple aqueducts, some running for over 50 miles before reaching the city, carried on graceful arches across valleys, or channeled underground through hillsides, always sloping gently downward so that the water moves by gravity alone. It is an extraordinary feat of engineering, one that most Romans simply take for granted, the way we might take for granted a light switch or a tap. Water flows into the city constantly, day and night, filling public fountains, feeding the great bathhouses, and even, for the wealthiest households, running through lead pipes directly into private homes. At the fountain, Lucia is not alone. A handful of other early risers have gathered as well, filling their own jars, exchanging quiet greetings in the dark. This is one of the small, recurring rhythms of Roman life, a moment of neighborhood connection, repeated every single morning for centuries, long before written history began to record such details, and long after this particular morning has been forgotten. Meanwhile, in the bakeries scattered throughout the city, a different kind of work is already well underway. Rome runs on bread, and has for generations. The state itself, through a system that developed and expanded over many years, distributes grain and eventually baked bread to a portion of the citizen population, a policy that emperors maintained in part to keep the vast population fed, and in turn, calm. But beyond this state distribution, ordinary commercial bakeries also operate throughout the city, and their ovens must be lit hours before the sun rises if the first loaves are to be ready when the streets begin to fill. Picture one such bakery, its stone oven glowing orange in the dark, a baker, and perhaps 2 assistants moving in practiced silence around it. The flour they use has traveled a long way to to reach this room. Ground from wheat grown in the fertile fields of Egypt, or Sicily, or North Africa, shipped across the Mediterranean, unloaded at the port of Ostia, carried up the Tiber by barge, and finally hauled through the city streets in those same slow-moving carts we heard earlier in the dark. The scale of this operation, repeated every single day for a city of this size, is difficult to comprehend even now. It required a level of organization, shipping, storage, and distribution that took the Roman state centuries to develop into something resembling reliability. The bread itself, once baked, is often a dense, dark, and satisfying round loaf, sometimes marked on top with lines that make it easier to divide into portions by hand. For many Romans, this bread, along with olive oil and a portion of wine mixed generously with water, will make up the greater part of their daily diet, supplemented by vegetables, legumes, and occasionally, for those who can afford it, meat or fish. As the first hint of gray begins to touch the eastern sky, other sounds begin to layer into the quiet. A rooster somewhere calls out, answered faintly by another farther away. A dog barks once, then falls silent. In the temples scattered across the city's hills, priests and their attendants are beginning their own quiet preparations, tending to the eternal flames and morning rituals owed to the gods, who, in the Roman understanding of the world, watch over the city and its people with the same steady attention that a parent might give to a household. It is worth remembering, here in this gentle hour, that the people of ancient Rome did not think of themselves as living in ancient times at all. To them, this was simply the present, an ordinary Tuesday, or whatever the Roman equivalent of an ordinary morning might have felt like. They woke, as we do, with small aches and small hopes, thinking about debts owed and favors to be repaid, about children to be fed and work to be done. The grandeur of Rome that we picture today, the marble temples and towering monuments, existed alongside all of this deeply ordinary human life, the water fetching and the bread baking, and the quiet murmured greetings exchanged in the dark. As the sky continues its slow shift from black to deep blue, to the first soft blush of coming dawn, the city begins, almost imperceptibly, to gather itself. The carts that moved so freely in the night begin to thin out, retreating before the coming daylight hours, when wheeled traffic will again be forbidden. Lamps are extinguished one by one as daylight makes them unnecessary, and across the 7 hills of Rome, in a million small rooms and grand houses alike, people are beginning to rise, to dress, and to prepare for whatever this particular day will ask of them. We will follow many of them in the hours ahead. But for now, in this last stretch of darkness before true morning arrives, let yourself rest here in this quiet, unhurried scene. The water carriers walking home with full jars, the bakers pulling the first loaves from glowing ovens, the whole enormous, ancient city drawing its first slow breath of a new day, as the first true light of morning spreads across the rooftops of Rome. touching the red clay tiles with a soft gold, the character of the city begins to change. The private hours of night give way to the more structured hours of day. And nowhere is this shift more visible than inside the homes of the city's wealthier citizens. Let us step gently and without hurry into one such home, a domus belonging to a moderately prosperous family, perhaps a merchant or a minor official, somewhere on the slopes of the Esquiline or Caelian Hill. Unlike the towering, crowded Insulae most Romans call home, a domus like this one spreads outward rather than upward, a single story or two, built around a central courtyard open to the sky. This courtyard, called the atrium, is the heart of the house, both literally and in the daily rhythm of family life. At its center lies a shallow rectangular pool called the impluvium, positioned directly beneath an opening in the roof so that rainwater can collect there. A simple and elegant piece of engineering that also fills the room with natural light. In the soft gray light of early morning, the surface of the water is perfectly still, occasionally disturbed by a single drop falling from the eaves above. The household is beginning to stir now, though with none of the urgency we might associate with a modern morning routine. There are no alarm clocks in this world, no rush to meet a train or beat traffic. Time itself is measured differently, marked by sundials during daylight hours, and by the movement of shadows across familiar walls, an approach to time that feels, to us, almost impossibly relaxed, though of course it carried its own quiet discipline. The head of this household, the paterfamilias, as Romans called the male head of family, rises and dresses with the help of an enslaved attendant, a common and unremarkable feature of daily life in this world that we should acknowledge honestly and without flinching. Since slavery was woven so completely into the fabric of Roman society that its absence would have been unimaginable to nearly everyone living at this time. Enslaved people worked in nearly every Roman household above the poorest tier, performing tasks from the most menial to the highly skilled, including as tutors, accountants, and physicians. Their lives, largely unrecorded and unremembered by the historical sources that have survived to us, made possible the daily comfort of the families they served. And it is worth pausing quietly to hold that truth alongside everything else we learned tonight about Roman daily life. The clothing this man puts on is simple by the standards of formal Roman dress. A tunic first, a straightforward garment of wool or linen, belted at the waist, falling to somewhere around the knee. Over this, if he plans to conduct any official or public business today, he may add a toga, that heavy, carefully draped garment of white wool that we associate so strongly with Roman identity. Though in truth, most Romans, most of the time, simply wore their tunics and left the cumbersome toga folded away for more formal occasions. The toga itself required real skill to drape correctly, often with the help of a servant trained specifically in the art of arranging its many folds. and wearing one for an entire day was, by many contemporary accounts, a genuinely uncomfortable experience in Rome's warm climate. Elsewhere in the house, the woman of the household, the domina, begins her own morning. Roman women of this social class did not typically work outside the home for wages, but their daily responsibilities were nonetheless substantial. She oversees the household's enslaved staff, manages the family's finances and supplies, and often takes a significant role in the education of younger children, at least until sons reach an age when they might be sent to a more formal tutor or school. Her own dress is, like her husband's, layered and practical at its foundation. A simple tunic, over which she might wear a longer stola, the traditional garment marking a married Roman woman. Its straps, sometimes pinned at the shoulder with decorative brooches, if the family's means allow for such small luxuries. Her hair, too, receives careful attention this morning, arranged by an enslaved hairdresser called an ornatrix, who has likely served this same role in the household for years and has learned, through long practice, exactly how her mistress prefers her hair styled, whether in the simple, practical arrangements of an ordinary day or the more elaborate curled and braided styles reserved for occasions when the family will be seen in public. In the corner of the atrium, near the small household shrine known as the lararium, someone, perhaps the domina herself, or an older family member, pauses to offer a brief and quiet morning devotion to the household gods, the Lares and Penates, spirits believed to protect the home, its stores of food, and the family's continued well-being. This is not a dramatic ritual, nothing like the grand public ceremonies performed at the great temples elsewhere in the city. It is small, personal, and habitual, perhaps a pinch of incense placed on a small altar, a few murmured words spoken more from long custom than active thought, the same quiet gesture repeated every morning of this family's life, and the lives of the families who lived in this house before them. Breakfast itself, called intaculum, is a modest affair in most Roman households, wealthy or otherwise. There is no tradition here of a large, elaborate morning meal. Instead, family members eat lightly and somewhat informally, often standing or moving through the house rather than sitting together at a table. Bread again forms the foundation, torn from a loaf much like the ones we watched emerge from the ovens in the dark hours before dawn, perhaps dipped in olive oil or eaten alongside a few olives, a bit of cheese made from sheep or goat's milk, and occasionally some dried fruit, if the season and the family's means allow for it. Children in the household, meanwhile, are preparing for their own day. For boys of this family's social standing, that likely means lessons, either with a private tutor who comes to the house, often an educated enslaved man, or a Greek freedman valued specifically for his learning. Or, if the family is more modest in means, but still values education, a walk through the city streets to a more public school, held not in a dedicated schoolhouse in the way we might imagine today, but often simply in a covered space along a street or in the corner of a forum, screened only by a curtain from the noise and bustle passing just beyond it. Roman education for boys of this class typically centers on reading, writing, and arithmetic in these earliest years, with an emphasis, as the child grows older, on rhetoric, the art of persuasive public speaking, which Roman society valued enormously, since public life, whether in law, politics, or business, depended heavily on a man's ability to speak well and persuasively in front of others. Discipline in these schools was often strict by modern standards, and Roman writers from this period occasionally complained, with some humor, about the noise of a schoolroom's recitations carrying out into the street, disrupting the peace of neighboring shopkeepers trying to conduct their own business nearby. For girls, education varied considerably depending on the family's values and resources. Some girls, particularly in wealthier or more progressively minded households, received an education similar to their brothers, at least in these early years, learning to read and write, and sometimes studying music or literature. For most girls, however, the emphasis shifted earlier toward the practical skills of running a household, spinning wool, weaving, and managing domestic affairs. Skills that would serve them well in the marriages many would enter while still quite young by modern standards, often in their mid to late teenage years. Outside, in the narrow street beyond the domus walls, the city continues its own slow awakening. Shopkeepers are unlatching wooden shutters and setting out their wares, the different sounds of different trades beginning to layer together. A coppersmith's hammer, a weaver's shuttle, the low murmur of early customers exchanging greetings and haggling gently over prices. Somewhere nearby, a barber is setting up his small folding stool along the street itself, since Roman barber shops were often nothing more than a chair and a mirror set against a convenient wall. A place where men would gather not only to be shaved, but to exchange the news and gossip of the day. A kind of informal social hub scattered throughout every neighborhood of the city. And so, in this steady, unhurried way, household by household, street by street, the great city of Rome eases itself fully into morning. There is no dramatic turning point to mark this transition, no single moment when night becomes day. It happens instead the way most real mornings happen, gradually, gently, one small domestic routine at a time, each one so familiar to the people performing it that they give it hardly any thought at all. Let yourself rest in this picture for a while. The quiet courtyard with its still pool of water, the soft murmur of a household beginning its day, the simple bread and oil of an unhurried breakfast. There is nothing urgent happening here, nothing that requires your full attention. Just the gentle, ordinary rhythm of people, so very like us in so many ways, easing themselves into another day almost 2,000 years ago. By the middle of the morning, the heart of Roman public life has fully come alive. And if we follow the streets downward, away from the residential hills, they lead us, as they led so many Romans each day, toward the Forum. The Roman Forum was not a single building, but a long, open space, a valley between hills that had been transformed over centuries into the ceremonial and administrative center of the entire empire. By this period, it is crowded on every side with temples, law courts, government buildings, and monuments, the accumulated architecture of hundreds of years of Roman history, each structure added by a different generation, a different emperor or magistrate wishing to leave some lasting mark on the city's most important public space. Walking through the Forum at this hour, you would find it filled with people, though not in the sense of chaotic crowding so much as a steady, purposeful flow of citizens moving between one errand and another. Men in togas move in small groups, deep in conversation, their attendants trailing a respectful distance behind carrying scrolls or waiting to run errands. Vendors call out gently from small stalls set up along the edges of the open space, selling everything from hot food to small trinkets and religious offerings for those visiting the nearby temples. This is also, importantly, the hour of the salutatio, one of the more distinctive social rituals of Roman life, and one that shaped the mornings of countless citizens across the social spectrum. In Roman society, wealthy and powerful men, called patrons, maintained relationships with a wide network of clients. Men of lower social and economic standing, who depended on their patron for financial support, legal protection, or career advancement, and who were expected, in turn, to demonstrate their loyalty through public displays of respect and support. Each morning, often beginning quite early, these clients would gather at their patron's home to offer a formal greeting, the salutatio itself. They might wait in an antechamber or courtyard, sometimes for a considerable while, before being received briefly by the patron, who might offer a few words, perhaps a small gift of money or food known as the sportula, and occasionally a request that the client accompany him later that day as he moved through the city, since a wealthy man's public prestige was measured partly by the size and visible loyalty of the retinue that followed him through the streets. It is worth noting gently that this system, while it might sound almost feudal to modern ears, was woven so deeply into the fabric of everyday Roman social and economic life that nearly everyone participated in some version of it, whether as patron, client, or often both at once, since even a moderately wealthy man might serve as patron to those beneath him, while simultaneously serving as client to someone still more powerful above him. It was less a hierarchy, with only two levels, than a long, interconnected chain running from the emperor himself down to the humblest freedman, each link bound by obligations of loyalty and support flowing in both directions. Having completed their morning obligations, many of these same men would make their way, sometimes accompanied by the very clients who had greeted them earlier, into the forum itself to conduct the actual business of the day. And there was a great deal of business to conduct. The Roman legal system, remarkably sophisticated for its time, and profoundly influential on the legal traditions that would follow it for the next 2,000 years, operated largely in public, with disputes heard and argued in open air or under the covered porticos that lined much of the forum's edges. A trial in this period might unfold not behind closed doors, but almost as public theater, with crowds of interested onlookers, some simply curious, others perhaps friends or rivals of the parties involved, gathering to watch skilled orators argue their cases. Public speaking, as we touched on earlier when discussing the education of Roman boys, was considered one of the highest and most useful skills a Roman man could possess. And successful advocates could build substantial reputations and substantial fortunes through their courtroom eloquence alone. Nearby, in the shade of covered walkways called porticos, other kinds of business unfold at a gentler pace. Moneylenders and bankers, whom the Romans called argentarii, conduct their affairs at small tables, exchanging currency, extending loans, and keeping careful records of transactions on wax tablets. A common and reusable writing surface consisting of a wooden frame filled with blackened wax, which could be inscribed with a pointed stylus, and then smoothed flat again for reuse. A practical solution in a world where paper, or more accurately papyrus, imported from Egypt, remained a somewhat costly resource reserved for more permanent records. If we continue walking, following the natural flow of foot traffic away from the central forum, we come to the markets, another essential thread in the daily fabric of Roman life. The most famous of these by this period is a large, multi-level market complex built into the slope of a nearby hill. Its curved brick facade rising above the surrounding streets, containing dozens of individual shops selling goods from across the known world. Spices from as far away as India and southern Arabia. Silk carried along trade routes stretching all the way to China, though by the time it reached Roman hands, it had likely passed through the hands of many intermediary traders along the way. Wine from Gaul and Hispania. Fine pottery from Gaul as well, its red glazed surface considered highly fashionable among Rome's wealthier households. The sensory experience of walking through such a market would have been considerable. Layers of smell and sound and color competing for attention at every turn, though we should imagine it, for our purposes tonight, not as overwhelming, but simply as full, rich, alive, the way any thriving marketplace feels even now in cities around the world, a controlled and familiar kind of bustle rather than true chaos. Away from the grand marketplace, in smaller shops lining nearly every street in the city, artisans practice their trades in full view of passers-by. Since Roman shops, called tabernae, typically opened directly onto the street through a wide doorway, with the front of the shop functioning almost as a stage for the work happening within. A cobbler might be seen stitching leather sandals at his workbench. A blacksmith's hammer rings rhythmically against hot metal. A weaver's loom clacks steadily in the back of a narrow shop, selling finished cloth at the front. Bakeries, of course, continue their work from before dawn, their fronts now open to sell the day's loaves directly to passing customers, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the countless other scents of the street. It is worth pausing here to consider just how much of Roman economic life happened, quite literally, in public view, in a way that feels notably different from much of modern commercial life, tucked as it often is behind closed doors, screens, and shipping warehouses. In Rome, production and sale happened together in the same small space, visible to anyone walking past. A continuous, visible thread connecting the raw materials arriving from across the empire to the finished goods passing into the hands of ordinary citizens. Above many of these ground floor shops, as we touched on earlier, rise the Insulae, those tall residential blocks housing the majority of Rome's population. And so the rhythm of the street continues upward as well as outward. Shopkeepers below going about their trades, while several floors above them, families continue their own quieter domestic routines. The sounds of the street below drifting faintly upward through open windows, an ever-present backdrop to daily life at every level of this densely layered, endlessly overlapping city. By now, the sun has risen well above the rooftops, and the day's heat, depending on the season, is beginning to make itself felt. The pace of the forum and the markets will continue for some hours yet, but already there is a subtle shift in the air, a sense that the busiest part of the morning has passed its peak and begun its slow, gentle descent toward midday, when many Romans will pause their work, retreat from the sun's growing warmth, and turn their attention toward food, rest, and the cooler hours that lie ahead. We will follow them there next, into the markets and kitchens where the midday meal takes shape, and into the great public bathhouses that formed such a central part of daily Roman life. But for now, let this scene of the forum settle gently into your mind. The togaed men moving in quiet conversation, the murmur of trials unfolding beneath covered porticos, the rhythmic sounds of craftsmen at work in shops open to the street. All of it part of the same slow, steady current of ordinary life flowing through the center of an ancient city. As the sun climbs toward its highest point, the rhythm of the city begins to shift once again, settling into the unhurried middle stretch of the day. For many Romans, particularly those who labor with their hands rather than in the courts and offices of the forum, midday brings a pause, a brief and welcome release from the morning's work before the afternoon resumes. Let us turn our attention now to the Insulae, those tall apartment blocks we glimpsed earlier, rising above the shops and workshops of the city's crowded streets. It was here, in these buildings, rather than in the spacious private houses of the wealthy, that most Romans actually lived out the greater part of their daily lives. And it is worth spending some time here now, in the gentle midday light, imagining what that life was actually like. An insula might rise 5, 6, occasionally even more stories above the street, though buildings of excessive height were eventually restricted by law after repeated collapses made clear the dangers of poorly built upper floors, added hastily by landlords eager to fit more tenants into a limited footprint. The lower floors, closest to the street, were generally the most desirable, often consisting of slightly larger rooms, and sometimes even a small private space for a family of modest means. The higher one climbed, the smaller, cheaper, and more precarious the living conditions became. Single cramped rooms shared by entire families, reached by narrow wooden staircases that creaked and swayed underfoot. Life on these upper floors lacked many comforts we would consider essential today. There was no running water this high above the street, meaning every drop used for cooking, cleaning, or drinking had to be carried up by hand from the public fountains below, a task that fell, more often than not, to women and children, repeated multiple times throughout the day. There were no private latrines either, for the most part, meaning residents relied on public facilities scattered through the city, or on chamber pots that were sometimes emptied directly out of windows into the streets below, a hazard that pedestrians learned through hard experience to watch for and avoid. And yet, despite these hardships, the Insulae were not simply grim, joyless places. They were, in their own crowded way, deeply communal. Neighbors knew neighbors in a manner that dense, vertical living naturally encourages. Voices carried easily between the thin walls and open windows of adjoining rooms, meaning private life in an insula was rarely entirely private. But this same closeness also meant that help, company, and news were never far away. A woman minding several children at once might call upon a neighbor to watch them for an hour. Gossip, news of the wider city, and small kindnesses passed easily up and down the shared staircases. At midday, with the sun now high overhead, many residents of the Insulae take their main meal of the day, called prandium, though the timing and formality of this meal varied considerably depending on one's occupation and social standing. For those who worked the markets and shops we visited in the previous hour, this might mean a quick and simple meal eaten standing, purchased from one of the many small food stalls and Pompeii informal eateries scattered throughout nearly every neighborhood of the city. These Pompeii deserve a moment of our attention, since they represent one of the most ordinary, yet most overlooked aspects of daily Roman life. Because so many residents of the Insulae lacked any real kitchen facilities of their own, cooking over an open flame in these crowded wooden buildings being both impractical and dangerous. A great many Romans simply did not cook most of their meals at home at all. Instead, they relied on these small, informal food shops, often nothing more than a counter opening onto the street, behind which sat large ceramic containers sunk into a stone counter, keeping stews, porridges, and simple dishes warm throughout the day for hungry customers passing by. A typical offering at such a stall might include a simple grain porridge called pools, the ancient staple that predates even bread as the foundation of the Roman diet, flavored perhaps with vegetables, beans, or, for those willing to pay a bit more, small pieces of meat or fish. Chickpeas, lentils, and other legumes appear frequently in the archaeological and written record of Roman cuisine, alongside vegetables like cabbage, leeks, and onions, which grew readily in the countryside surrounding the city and were carried in daily alongside the grain we heard arriving in the dark hours before dawn. Wine, too, played its steady role in the midday meal, though we should be careful here to correct a common misconception. Romans very rarely drank wine undiluted. It was instead typically mixed with water, sometimes in proportions as generous as 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine, a practice that made the drink both more affordable to stretch across a household's needs and considerably less intoxicating than wine consumed at full strength, a habit the Romans themselves associated with excess and a lack of self-control. If we step back out into the street during this midday hour, we find the pace of the city noticeably gentler than it was during the busy morning hours in the Forum. The heat of the day, particularly in the warmer months, encourages many Romans to seek out shade, whether beneath the covered porticos lining major streets, in the cool interior rooms of their homes, or simply by retreating indoors until the worst of the afternoon heat has passed. It is not unusual at this hour to see shops with their shutters partially drawn, their owners resting quietly in the back rooms, waiting for custom to pick up again as the day cools toward evening. Children, too, find their own rhythms during these midday hours. Those attending the small street corner schools we mentioned earlier often finish their lessons around this time, since Roman schooling typically did not extend through the full length of the day in the way modern schooling does. Freed from their lessons, children might help with small household tasks, run errands for their families, or simply play in the streets and courtyards of their neighborhood. Games involving knucklebones, small balls, or simple races and chasing games that would look entirely familiar to children playing in any city street today. A small and comforting reminder of just how much of ordinary human life remains unchanged across the centuries, even as the great monuments and empires around it rise and eventually fall. For those Romans working outdoors, in trades that depend on daylight and physical labor, construction workers building or repairing the city's endless architecture, dockworkers unloading goods along the riverbank, laundry workers, called fullones, tending to the enormous vats of cleaning solution used to treat and whiten woolen cloth. Midday brings a welcome pause from physical exertion, a chance to eat, rest briefly in whatever shade can be found, and gather strength for the afternoon hours still ahead. It is worth reflecting for a moment, in this quiet midday lull, on just how physically demanding daily life was for the great majority of Rome's population. We often picture ancient Rome through the lens of its emperors, its senators, its grand marble buildings. But the truth of daily life for most residents involved hard, repetitive physical labor, carried out under a hot Mediterranean sun, sustained by simple food and diluted wine, and structured around the practical realities of a city that, for all its engineering brilliance in aqueducts and roads and public buildings, still required an enormous amount of human effort simply to keep functioning day after day. And yet, within all of this labor, there remained space for small pleasures too. A shared meal with neighbors on a shaded doorstep, a few moments of rest in the cool interior of a modest home, the simple, quiet satisfaction of watching one's children play safely nearby, laughing over some small game passed down unknowingly from generations before them, and destined, though none of them could know it, to be passed down through many generations still to come. As the midday hour begins to soften into afternoon, the city holds this gentle, unhurried pace a while longer, before, in the hours ahead, its attention turns toward one of the most beloved and distinctive institutions of Roman daily life, an experience so central to what it meant to live in this city that we will spend our next chapter there entirely, following ordinary Romans as they make their way, as they did nearly every single day, toward the great public bathhouses of the city. Of all the daily rituals that shaped life in ancient Rome, few were as beloved or as central to the city's social fabric as the afternoon visit to the public baths, as the midday heat begins to ease and the working hours of the morning draw to their natural close. Romans from nearly every level of society begin making their way toward one of the many bathhouses scattered throughout the city. Some modest neighborhood establishments, others vast and magnificent complexes built and maintained at enormous expense by the emperors themselves as gifts to the people of Rome. To understand just how central bathing was to Roman daily life, it helps to set aside any modern comparison to a quick, private shower or bath. The Roman bathhouse, called thermae when referring to the grandest imperial complexes, or simply balnea for smaller establishments, was as much a social and civic institution as it was a place for personal hygiene. A space where Romans of different backgrounds gathered daily to bathe, exercise, converse, conduct business, and simply pass the afternoon hours in pleasant company. The entrance fee to most public baths was remarkably modest, often just a small coin, low enough that bathing remained accessible to nearly everyone in the city, from wealthy senators to modest shopkeepers, and on certain days made available freely to all through the generosity of emperors or wealthy benefactors seeking public favor. This accessibility meant that the baths functioned as one of the great social levelers of Roman life, a daily gathering space that, however briefly, brought together people who might otherwise never cross paths in their ordinary business. Let us follow an ordinary Roman, a shopkeeper perhaps, closing up his small taberna for the afternoon, as he makes his way through the gradually cooling streets toward the baths. Even from some distance, the bathhouse announces itself, first through the low murmur of voices and splashing water carrying out into the surrounding streets, and then, as one draws closer, through the sheer scale of the building itself, particularly if this happens to be one of the grand imperial thermae, structures so vast they might occupy several city blocks, their soaring vaulted ceilings and towering walls rising above the surrounding rooftops like small mountains of brick and marble. Stepping inside, our shopkeeper first passes through the apoditerium, the changing room, where he removes his tunic and leaves it, along with any other belongings, in a small wall niche, sometimes watched over by an enslaved attendant hired specifically to guard against theft. Since even in a bathhouse frequented daily by the same familiar faces, the loss of one's only set of clothing was a genuine and often mentioned concern in surviving Roman sources. From here, the bathing experience typically follows a deliberate and unhurried sequence, one designed less for efficiency than for the gradual, pleasurable transition of the body from cool to warm to hot and back again. A ritual not unlike, in its slow and considered pacing, the very documentary you are listening to now. The visitor might begin in the palestra, an open exercise courtyard attached to many bathhouses, where Romans engaged in mild physical activity, wrestling, ball games, or simply walking and stretching, considered an important preparation for the bathing that would follow, warming the body gently before entering the heated rooms proper. From the palestra, our shopkeeper moves into the tepidarium, a warm room gently heated that serves as a transitional space, allowing the body to adjust gradually before entering the more intense heat that lies ahead. The Romans achieved this heating through a remarkable feat of engineering called the hypocaust system, in which the floors of these heated rooms were raised on small brick pillars, creating a hollow space beneath through which hot air, generated by furnaces tended continuously by enslaved workers in service passages beneath the building, circulated freely, warming the floor, and through hollow flues built into the walls, the air of the room itself. It was, in effect, an ancient form of central heating, one so effective that some of these bathhouses could maintain comfortable warmth even during the cooler months of the Roman winter. Beyond the tepidarium lies the caldarium, the hottest room in the bathing sequence, filled with steam and heat radiating up through the floor beneath bare feet, containing a large hot pool where bathers might soak, sweating freely, easing the tension from muscles worked hard during the morning's labor. It is here, in this warm, steamy air, that much of the bathhouse's characteristic social atmosphere comes alive. Quiet conversations drifting between acquaintances, soaking side by side, the gentle splash of water, the low echo of voices carrying pleasantly beneath the high vaulted ceilings above. Rather than soap, which existed, but was not yet the primary tool of Roman cleansing, bathers typically had their skin anointed with scented olive oil, which was then scraped away, along with accumulated sweat and grime, using a curved metal tool called a strigil. This scraping process, performed either by the bather himself or, for those who could afford it, by a skilled attendant, was considered an essential part of the cleansing ritual. After the heat of the caldarium, many bathers would move to the frigidarium, a room housing a cold plunge pool, a bracing final step that closed the pores and left the skin feeling refreshed and invigorated. A sharp but brief sensation before stepping back out into the changing room to dry off and dress once more. But to describe only the physical sequence of bathing is to miss much of what made these institutions so genuinely beloved across Roman society. The baths were in many ways the social media of their era, a daily gathering place where news traveled, friendships were maintained, business deals were quietly discussed over a shared soak in the caldarium, and where a person might simply enjoy an hour or two of unhurried company, conversation, and rest in the middle of an otherwise demanding day. Many of the grandest bathhouses offered far more than bathing alone. Libraries, sometimes stocked with hundreds of scrolls covering literature, history, and philosophy, allowed visitors to read quietly in adjoining rooms. Gardens planted with shade trees and lined with covered walkways offered space for gentle strolling conversation. Small shops and food vendors clustered around the entrances, selling snacks and refreshments to bathers on their way in or out. Some complexes even included small theaters or lecture halls where poets and philosophers might share their work with an audience of relaxed, freshly bathed listeners. It is worth pausing to consider what this daily ritual might have meant to the ordinary Romans who practiced it day after day for their entire lives. In a world without private indoor plumbing for most residents, without the constant background noise of modern communication technology pulling attention in a dozen directions at once, the baths offered something genuinely valuable: a guaranteed daily interval of physical comfort, social connection, and unhurried rest, built directly into the structure of everyday life rather than something to be squeezed in around the edges of a busy schedule. As afternoon light filters down through the high windows of the bathhouse, catching the steam rising gently off heated pools, our shopkeeper and thousands of Romans across the city doing much the same thing at this very hour, allows the accumulated tension of the day's labor to ease slowly from his shoulders. There is little urgency here, little sense of needing to move quickly to the next task. This hour belongs to rest, to warmth, to the simple pleasure of clean skin and quiet company, a small daily gift that the city offered in some form to nearly all of its residents, regardless of how modest their circumstances might otherwise be. As the afternoon light begins its long, gradual slide toward evening, our shopkeeper eventually dresses once more, steps back out into the cooling streets, and rejoins the gentle current of the city, refreshed and unhurried, ready for whatever remains of the day ahead. The evening meal, time with family, or simply the quiet satisfaction of walking home through familiar streets. As the golden light of late afternoon settles softly over the rooftops of Rome, as the heat of the day continues its slow retreat, and the light outside softens into the warm gold of late afternoon, Roman life shifts once more, this time toward leisure, toward the unhurried pleasures that filled the hours between the baths and the evening meal still to come. Not every Roman, of course, enjoyed equal access to leisure. For the enslaved members of countless households across the city, and for many among the working poor, the demands of labor continued well into the evening hours, a reality we should hold honestly alongside the more comfortable pictures of Roman leisure we are about to explore. But for a great many residents of the city, this stretch of the afternoon offered a genuine and valued pause, a time set aside for walking, conversation, and quiet entertainment before the day's final duties began. Among the most cherished spaces for this kind of afternoon leisure were Rome's public gardens, several of which had been created and maintained over the generations, specifically as gifts to the people of the city from wealthy citizens or the emperors themselves. These gardens offered something increasingly precious within a city as dense and built up as Rome had become by this period. Open green space, shaded walkways lined with plane trees, and the gentle sound of fountains, a welcome contrast to the packed streets and towering Insulae that dominated so much of daily urban life. Picture for a moment one of these gardens in the soft light of late afternoon. Gravel paths wind between carefully tended beds of flowers and ornamental shrubs, interspersed with marble statues, copies, or original works celebrating gods, historical figures, and idealized human forms. Since Roman appreciation for Greek artistic tradition ran deep, and wealthy patrons throughout the city's history had commissioned or imported countless such statues to adorn public and private spaces alike. Along these paths, small groups of Romans stroll at an unhurried pace, engaged in quiet conversation. Perhaps two old friends discuss the outcome of a recent court case they had both followed with interest. Perhaps a small group of philosophy students walk alongside their teacher, continuing a discussion begun earlier that day. Since walking and talking together was considered, by many Roman and Greek thinkers alike, an ideal setting for genuine intellectual exchange, unhurried by the pressures of a formal lecture hall. Children, too, find their way into these gardens during the afternoon hours, playing simple games beneath the watchful eyes of parents or household attendants. A popular pastime among Roman children involved a simple hoop, called a trochus, rolled along the ground and guided with a small stick, the child running alongside to keep it upright and moving. A game that would look entirely familiar to any observer from almost any century since. Others might play with small terracotta or bone dolls, wooden toy animals, or engage in simple games involving throwing and catching small balls. Laughter carrying softly across the garden in the warm afternoon air. For those seeking a different kind of afternoon entertainment, the city offered a wide range of options. Though we should approach this particular thread of Roman life with the same gentle, unhurried care we have brought to everything else tonight, describing rather than dwelling, informing rather than dramatizing. The theater held a genuine and long-standing place in Roman cultural life, with performances of comedy, and to a lesser extent tragedy, drawing audiences from across the social spectrum to open-air theaters built into hillsides or freestanding structures of stone and brick. A comedic performance, perhaps one of the well-worn favorites by playwrights whose work had already entertained Roman audiences for generations by this period, might unfold on a stage adorned with a painted backdrop. Actors wearing exaggerated masks that helped project both their voice and their character clearly to audience members seated even in the farthest rows of the theater's curved seating. The Circus Maximus, that vast oval racetrack nestled in the valley between two of Rome's hills, also drew enormous crowds during the afternoon hours, particularly on days when chariot races were scheduled. We will not linger long on the details of the races themselves this evening, since the roaring crowds and thundering hooves belong more properly to a livelier hour of storytelling than the calm one we are cultivating tonight. It is enough, for our purposes, simply to note that the circus existed, that it could hold an enormous number of spectators at once, and that, on race days, a significant portion of the city's population might make their way there together, filling the surrounding streets with a slow, steady river of people moving toward the same shared destination. For those preferring quieter company, taverns and small wine shops scattered throughout the city offered another popular gathering place during these afternoon hours. Spaces where men, primarily, though not exclusively, might sit together over cups of watered wine, playing simple games of chance with dice or small gaming boards, discussing the news of the day, or simply enjoying a period of rest in familiar company before returning home for the evening meal. Board games, in fact, held a beloved place in Roman leisure culture more broadly, played not only in taverns, but in homes and gardens throughout the city. Games resembling later versions of backgammon and simple strategy games, played with small counters on gridded boards, have been found scratched directly into the stone paving of public spaces throughout the Roman world, suggesting that idle moments, waiting for a friend, resting between errands, were often filled with a quick game played wherever a flat surface and a few small stones or tokens happened to be available. Reading, too, occupied the leisure hours of literate Romans, a smaller portion of the population overall, but a meaningful one, particularly among the middle and upper classes. Scrolls of papyrus, containing poetry, history, philosophy, or drama, could be purchased from booksellers whose shops clustered in certain neighborhoods of the city, or borrowed from the libraries we mentioned earlier. Both the grand public libraries, attached to some bathhouses and forums, and smaller private collections maintained by wealthier households, sometimes numbering in the hundreds or even thousands of individual scrolls. As the afternoon continues its gentle decline toward evening, the light outside deepens further, the gold of late afternoon giving way gradually to the softer, warmer tones that precede sunset. Across the city, this unhurried rhythm of leisure begins, in its own slow way, to wind down. As families and friends begin making their way home, anticipating the evening meal and the quiet hours of rest that will follow it, there's something worth sitting with quietly in this particular stretch of the Roman day. For all the ways that ancient Roman society differed from our own in its social structures, its acceptance of slavery, its vast inequalities of wealth and opportunity, there remains something deeply familiar in these afternoon hours we have just wandered through together. The pleasure of a walk through a garden, the comfort of quiet conversation with an old friend, a child's simple delight in a rolling hoop or a well-thrown ball, a shared game over cups of wine as the light softens outside. These small human pleasures have changed remarkably little across nearly 2,000 years. A gentle thread of continuity running quietly beneath all the grander, more dramatic history that tends to dominate our attention. As evening approaches and the households of Rome begin turning their thoughts toward the meal that will close out the day, let this feeling of unhurried, gentle continuity settle over you as well. There is nothing left to accomplish in this hour, nothing urgent waiting just ahead. Only the soft golden light of a Roman afternoon, easing gradually, gently, toward evening. As the sun continues its slow descent toward the western hills beyond the city, the light takes on the deep amber quality particular to Mediterranean evenings. And across Rome, in households both grand and humble, attention turns toward the final and most substantial meal of the day, the cena. Unlike the light breakfast we witnessed earlier, or the often hurried midday meal eaten standing at a street-side stall, the cena represented, for those with the means and leisure to observe it properly, a genuine occasion, a slower, more deliberate gathering that might stretch across 2 or even 3 unhurried hours. As evening settled fully over the city, let us return, for this part of our journey, to the household we visited earlier in the day, that moderately prosperous domus on the slopes of one of Rome's 7 hills. As evening approaches, the kitchen, a modest room tucked toward the back of the house, its walls darkened with years of accumulated smoke, comes alive with quiet, practiced activity. Here, over a simple raised hearth, an enslaved cook, perhaps assisted by one or two others, begins the careful work of preparing the evening's dishes, work that, in a household of this size, might have begun hours earlier with the marketing trip taken that morning to select fresh ingredients from the stalls and shops we wandered through during our visit to the Forum. The Roman kitchen of this period, it is worth noting gently, bore little resemblance to a modern kitchen. There was no oven built into the wall for baking, that task typically left to the professional bakeries, whose ovens we visited in the earliest hours of this documentary. Instead, cooking centered around a simple raised masonry hearth, fueled by charcoal, over which pots and pans could be positioned at varying heights and distances from the heat, allowing a skilled cook to simmer, boil, and fry with considerable precision, despite the apparent simplicity of the setup. The ingredients gathered for this evening's meal reflect the particular rhythms of trade and agriculture that sustained the entire city. Perhaps there are fresh vegetables purchased that very morning, cabbage or leeks, or the small, flavorful onions common throughout Roman cuisine. Perhaps there is fish carried up from the coast or caught in the Tiber itself, or for a household of somewhat greater means, perhaps a cut of pork or lamb, meat remaining throughout most of Roman history, a marker of relative prosperity rather than an everyday staple for the majority of the population. A distinctive feature of Roman cooking, one that might surprise a modern palate, was the widespread use of a fermented fish sauce called garum, produced by allowing fish, salt, and various aromatic herbs to ferment slowly over a period of weeks or months, resulting in a pungent, savory liquid used much the way we might use salt or soy sauce today, to add depth and complexity to nearly every kind of dish. Garum was produced commercially in enormous quantities along the coasts of the Roman world, shipped in sealed containers to markets throughout the empire, and prized enough that certain regional varieties commanded significantly higher prices than others, not unlike the way certain wines or cheeses are prized above others in culinary traditions today. Herbs and spices, too, played their role in seasoning the evening meal, though the boldest and most exotic spices, pepper carried all the way from India, for instance, remained luxuries reserved for wealthier tables. More commonly, Roman cooks reached for herbs grown in nearby gardens or the countryside beyond the city walls, cumin, coriander, rue, and mint among them, along with the ever-present combination of olive oil and wine used in cooking as generously as in drinking. As the meal takes shape in the kitchen, the family and any guests who might have been invited begin to gather in the triclinium, the formal dining room found in homes of this social standing, named for the 3 couches arranged around 3 sides of a low central table, upon which diners reclined on one elbow, a posture that that strikes many modern listeners as unusual, but one that Romans, and the Greeks before them, considered the proper and dignified way to enjoy an evening meal, reserved specifically for formal dining rather than the everyday breakfast or lunch, which were far more often eaten sitting or standing. If guests have been invited this evening, their arrival follows its own familiar social customs. A host might invite friends, business associates, or clients from his circle of patronage. The same network of relationships we touched on earlier when discussing the morning salutatio. A dinner invitation carried real social weight in Roman culture, an opportunity to strengthen alliances, discuss business, or simply enjoy an evening of company, conversation, and modest entertainment among people bound together by the complex, overlapping obligations of Roman social life. The meal itself typically unfolded across several distinct courses, beginning with the gustatio, a lighter opening course meant to stimulate the appetite, perhaps eggs, olives, or small savory dishes served alongside a cup of honeyed wine called mulsum. This gave way to the main course, or prima mensa, the heart of the meal, which might include several dishes served in succession. The fish or meat we mentioned earlier, alongside vegetables, bread, and sauces built around that distinctive garum we described a moment ago. Finally, the meal closed with the second mensa, a final course of fruit, nuts, and for wealthier households, perhaps small honeyed pastries, a gentle sweetness to close out the evening's dining before conversation continued, often for a good while longer over cups of wine mixed, as always, generously with water. Conversation during this extended meal covered much the same ground that dinner conversation covers in any era and any culture. News of the day, gossip about mutual acquaintances, discussion of recent events in the forum or the courts, and among households with intellectual inclinations, genuine philosophical or literary discussion, sometimes even accompanied by a hired reader or musician, providing gentle background entertainment, a soft accompaniment to the evening's unhurried conversation, rather than a performance demanding full attention. Meanwhile, in the crowded Insulae scattered throughout the rest of the city, the evening meal for most ordinary Romans looked considerably more modest, though no less meaningful to the families sharing it. Without the space, staff, or resources for an elaborate multi-course cena, a typical working family might gather around whatever small table their cramped quarters allowed, sharing bread, a simple vegetable dish, perhaps a bit of cheese, and, if the day had gone reasonably well, a cup of wine to close out the evening's labor. For families in the Insulae without kitchen facilities of their own, this evening meal might once again come from one of the neighborhood popani we discussed earlier, purchased already prepared and carried home, or in some cases, eaten right there at the small counter, alongside neighbors and familiar faces doing much the same thing. A modest but genuinely communal way to close out the working day. as the evening deepens and lamps are lit throughout the city, their small, warm flames flickering in windows across every hill and neighborhood. There is a shared quality to this hour that cuts across the very real differences in wealth and circumstance we have described tonight. Whether in the formal triclinium of a prosperous domus or the cramped single room of a modest insula, this is the hour when the labor of the day gives way at last to rest, to food, to the company of family and friends, and to the simple, universal comfort of sitting down together as darkness settles gently over the city outside, as the last traces of daylight fade from the sky above Rome, and the warm glow of oil lamps begins to replace the natural light of day in windows across the city. The character of urban life shifts once again, taking on the particular rhythms and textures of the Roman night. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that might not be immediately obvious to a modern listener. Night in ancient Rome was, in a very real and practical sense, dark in a way that few of us experience today. There was no public street lighting to speak of, beyond the occasional lamp maintained outside a wealthy household or shop, or the flickering torches carried by those who could afford to hire a link boy, a servant whose sole task was to light the way home through unlit streets with a torch or lantern. For the majority of Romans, moving through the city after dark meant moving through genuine darkness, broken only by moonlight, the scattered glow of lamps in windows, and whatever small light one carried oneself. This darkness shaped the character of nighttime Rome considerably. The bustling commercial energy of the daytime streets, the shops with shutters thrown open, the crowded forum, the ringing hammers of craftsmen at work, quieted substantially after sundown, replaced by a stiller, more cautious atmosphere. Ancient writers, including the poet Juvenal, who lived and wrote during roughly this period, described the genuine hazards of moving through Rome's streets at night, from the risk of tripping on uneven paving in the dark, to the danger of debris or waste tossed carelessly from the windows of the Insulae towering above, to the more serious concern of encountering thieves or troublemakers in the unlit alleys threading through the city's poorer neighborhoods. For this reason, wealthier Romans venturing out after dark typically did so with some care, accompanied by servants carrying torches, and sometimes by hired guards for additional protection, particularly in less familiar or less reputable parts of the city. Ordinary Romans, meanwhile, without the resources for such precautions, generally preferred to complete whatever business required them to be outdoors well before nightfall, retreating instead to the relative safety and warmth of their own homes as darkness settled in. And yet, Rome at night was never entirely without activity. Certain trades and certain kinds of Roman life continued quietly through the darkened hours, a night shift, if we might borrow a modern term, running parallel to the daylight rhythms we have followed throughout this documentary. We began this journey, in fact, with one such nighttime activity: the carts bringing grain and goods into the city under cover of darkness. Since, as we mentioned in our opening hours together, wheeled traffic was largely forbidden within the city during daylight hours, meaning the movement of heavy goods necessarily happened at night. The same slow creaking carts and patient oxen we imagined at the very start of our journey, now resuming their work as the streets empty of daytime pedestrian traffic. Bakers, too, as we noted earlier, began their work in these same dark hours, tending glowing ovens through the night so that fresh bread might be ready for the city's waking population. Watchmen called vigils, a service organized during the reign of the Emperor Augustus generations before our imagined evening, patrolled the streets of Rome specifically to guard against the fires that posed such a persistent danger to the city's densely packed wooden buildings, moving quietly through darkened neighborhoods, alert for the telltale glow or smell of flame that might, if left unchecked even briefly, spread rapidly through the tightly clustered Insulae we have visited so often tonight. Taverns and small wine shops, some of which we glimpsed during the afternoon leisure hours, often remained open well into the evening as well, their doorways spilling small pools of warm lamplight onto otherwise darkened streets, offering a gathering place for those who preferred company and conversation to an early retreat into sleep. Within these small establishments, the murmur of quiet conversation, the soft clink of cups, and the occasional burst of gentle laughter would have carried faintly out into the surrounding night. Small islands of warmth and human connection scattered through the darkened city. For most residents of Rome, however, this hour marked a gradual settling into rest. In the Insulae, families extinguished their lamps one by one as the night deepened, conserving the relatively costly oil that fueled them, and settled onto simple pallets, or, for the fortunate, proper beds, to rest after the physical demands of the day's labor. In the grander domus households, family members might retire to private bedchambers, small rooms typically located toward the rear of the house, away from the noise of the street, sparsely furnished by modern standards, containing little more than a bed frame, perhaps strung with rope or leather to support a mattress stuffed with wool or straw, and perhaps a small chest for storing personal belongings. Sleep itself, in this world lit only by fire and moonlight, followed rhythms shaped far more closely by the natural cycle of daylight and darkness than our own modern sleep patterns, so often disrupted by artificial light stretching long into the night. Many Romans likely retired not long after full darkness settled over the city, particularly outside the warmer summer months, when longer daylight hours naturally extended the day's activities. Some ancient sources suggest a pattern of sleep divided into two segments: an initial period of rest, followed by a period of quiet wakefulness in the deep night, and then a second period of sleep before dawn. Though the universality of this pattern across all of Roman society remains a subject of ongoing discussion among historians studying daily life in the ancient world. Above the darkened rooftops of the city, on a clear night, the same stars that we might look up at tonight would have been visible to Roman eyes as well, unclouded by the light pollution that obscures so much of the night sky from view in modern cities. It is a quiet thing to consider. This shared sky stretching across nearly 2,000 years, the same scattered constellations that a tired shopkeeper or a resting senator might have glanced up at before finally closing their eyes. The same slow wheel of stars turning gently overhead as the entire vast city, its forum and its markets and its baths and its million small households settled gradually, hill by hill and street by street, into the stillness of night. Somewhere in the darkness, a watchman continues his slow patrol, alert for the flicker of flame that might signal danger. Somewhere else, a baker feeds fresh charcoal into a glowing oven, preparing for the loaves that will greet the city's waking population before the sun has fully risen. And across the 7 hills, in a million small rooms, the ordinary people of Rome, so much like us in their tiredness, their small comforts, their quiet hopes for the day to come, drift, one by one, into sleep before we bring this particular day to its close. Let us widen our view for a while, stepping beyond the walls of the city itself to consider the quieter rhythms of life in the countryside surrounding Rome. Since the great city we have wandered through tonight depended, in every possible way, on the rural world stretching out around it. If we travel outward from the city gates, along one of the great roads radiating outward from Rome like spokes from a wheel, roads so well engineered that many of their routes remain in use, in some form, even now, we soon leave behind the dense press of Insulae and enter a gentler, more open landscape, gently rolling hills covered in olive groves, vineyards, and fields of wheat and barley, dotted here and there with the farmhouses and villas that sustained this rural way of life. Roman villas of this period fell into 2 broad categories, though the line between them often blurred considerably. There were villas rusticae, working farms focused on agricultural production, and villas urbanae, or sometimes simply villas, more leisurely country retreats maintained by wealthy Romans as a peaceful escape from the noise and pressure of city life. Though many properties combined elements of both, productive farmland surrounding a comfortable residence. Picture, for a moment, a modest working farm somewhere within a day's journey of the city. As evening settles here too, the rhythms differ noticeably from the urban patterns we have followed tonight. There is no market bell, no forum bustle, only the steady sounds of rural life winding down for the day, livestock being led into their pens, the last workers returning from the fields where they had spent the day tending vines or harvesting whatever crop the season called for, their pace unhurried by the particular pressures of city life, though certainly not free from the genuine physical demands of agricultural labor. Much of this agricultural work, it is worth noting honestly, was carried out by enslaved laborers, just as so much of the labor sustaining daily life within the city itself depended on enslaved people, a reality of the Roman economy that touched nearly every corner of society we have visited tonight. From the household kitchens preparing the evening cena to the furnaces heating the great public baths, to these very fields producing the wheat that became the bread eaten in every household across the city. The produce of these farms, the wheat, the olives pressed into oil, the grapes crushed and fermented into wine, made its way, eventually, into the city we have spent our evening exploring, carried along those same well-engineered roads, or, where geography allowed, loaded onto barges, and carried down rivers toward Rome, part of the vast, continuous flow of goods that sustained a population as large as the one crowded within the city's walls. We might think of this rural world, then, not as separate from the city, but as its quiet, essential foundation, the source from which nearly everything we witness tonight, the bread, the wine, the oil used both for cooking and for anointing skin at the baths, ultimately flowed. For wealthier Romans, the villa served a rather different purpose, one increasingly valued as the pressures and density of city life grew more pronounced over the centuries. A country villa offered space, quiet, and a change of pace considered genuinely restorative by Roman writers of this period, several of whom left behind detailed descriptions of their own country retreats, praising the pleasure of walking through a peaceful garden, reading uninterrupted beneath a shaded portico, or simply enjoying the relative silence of a rural evening after the constant noise of the city. One such writer, describing his own villa along the coast, wrote of the particular pleasure of falling asleep to the sound of the sea, a passage that feels, even now, remarkably relatable to anyone who has ever sought out quiet, natural sound as an aid to rest. The desire for peaceful, unhurried retreat from the pressures of daily life, it seems, is hardly a modern invention, but a very old and very human need, one the Romans understood and pursued in their own way, just as we might seek out quiet countryside, or perhaps simply a documentary like this one, as our own small retreat from the noise of contemporary life. As evening settles over this rural landscape, the darkness here feels different from the darkness of the city we described a short while ago. There are fewer lamps, fewer scattered points of light breaking the night, but there is also, in exchange, a wider, more open sky, and in the quiet away from the city's constant, low hum of human activity, sounds that would have been lost entirely amid the noise of Rome itself. The call of night birds, the gentle rustle of wind moving through olive groves, the distant, occasional bark of a farm dog, answered faintly by another farm some distance away. Not unlike, in fact, the very sounds we imagined drifting across the sleeping city at the very start of this journey. It is a fitting thing, perhaps, to consider this rural quiet now, as our own day in ancient Rome draws toward its close. The city we have explored together tonight, with all its noise and industry and crowded human life, the forum and its trials, the markets and their endless goods, the baths with their steam and murmured conversation, the crowded Insulae and the quieter domus households. All of it depended, ultimately, on this wider, gentler rhythm of rural life stretching out beyond the walls, fields and farms, and quiet villas, where the pace of life moved according to the seasons rather than the hours, and where a tired farmer, having led his last animal into its pen for the night, might look up at the same darkening sky we described a moment ago over the city and feel, in his own way, the same simple readiness for rest and sleep that awaited nearly everyone in every corner of the Roman world as this particular day finally came to its end. And so, as we draw our journey to its close tonight, let us return once more to the city itself, to Rome resting quietly beneath the same wide sky stretching out over the countryside we just visited, over the villas and farms, over the whole vast landscape of the ancient world. By this hour, the great city has grown largely still. The forum, so full of movement and conversation during the busy hours of morning, stands empty now beneath the moonlight, its temples and monuments silent and pale. The same marble columns that had witnessed the arguments of advocates and the greetings of patrons and clients, now simply standing, patient and unmoving, in the cool night air. The great bathhouses, too, have quieted, their heated pools slowly cooling, their vast rooms holding only silence where laughter and conversation had echoed just hours before. In the Insulae, most windows have gone dark now, their small oil lamps extinguished, their occupants settled into whatever rest the night could offer after a day of labor, water carrying, cooking, minding children, working in shops and markets and workshops scattered throughout the city. Here and there, a single lamp still flickers in a high window, perhaps a mother tending to a restless child, perhaps someone unable, for whatever quiet reason, to find sleep just yet. A small and gentle point of light in an otherwise darkened building, not so very different from the way a single lit window might look in any city, in any century, including our own. Along the Tiber, the river continues its slow, steady flow through the sleeping city, just as it had flowed through the dark hours before dawn when we began this journey together, carrying with it the same quiet persistence that has carried this river through the landscape for far longer than the city itself has existed, and that will continue long after this particular night. And this particular day we have followed so closely has faded into the vast and largely unrecorded expanse of ordinary history. We have spent this evening following people whose names we will never know. A water carrier rising before dawn, a household easing into its morning routine, a shopkeeper closing his stall for an afternoon at the baths, a family gathering for a modest evening meal in a crowded insula, a farmer leading his last animal into its pen as darkness settled over the countryside. None of these particular people left their names in the historical record. They were not senators or emperors, not generals or famous poets. They were simply the ordinary people of Rome, the vast and largely invisible majority whose daily labor, whose quiet routines, whose small pleasures and small hardships together made up the true lived texture of one of history's great civilizations. It is worth remembering, as we close this particular day, that history is so often told through the lives of the powerful, the emperors and generals whose names survive in inscriptions and monuments, while the far larger number of ordinary lives lives very much like our own in their essential shape, tend to fade quietly from the record, remembered only in the broad strokes that archaeology and careful historical reconstruction can offer us. And yet it was these ordinary lives, repeated day after day, generation after generation, that truly sustained the city we have wandered through together tonight, that built its aqueducts and baked its bread and carried its water and raised its children, and eventually simply grew tired, as all of us do, and went to sleep beneath the same stars we might look up at tonight, so very many centuries later. The city of Rome that we have visited this evening no longer exists in quite the form we have described. The empire that built it eventually changed, transformed, and gave way over centuries to new civilizations, new cities, new ways of ordering human life. But something of what we witnessed tonight, the simple daily rhythm of waking and working and resting, of gathering water and sharing meals, and seeking out warmth and company at the end of a long day, remains recognizable across all that distance of time. A quiet thread of shared human experience connecting us to people who lived and worked and slept in this same corner of the world, nearly 2,000 years before us. As the night deepens further over the sleeping city, and the last scattered lamps flicker and go dark one by one, let this same quiet stillness settle over you as well, wherever and whenever you happen to be listening to these words. There is nothing more to accomplish tonight, nothing left to learn or follow or understand. Only the same gentle, ancient rhythm of a day drawing to its close, and a great city, its forum, and its baths, and its markets, and its million quiet rooms, settling at last into rest. Sleep well, and should you wish to return to another quiet corner of the past, we will be here whenever you are ready to begin again.